And welcome to the visitors in the room that are not necessarily members of the IEEE student branch. Hi. So way back in the 1990s, we had a vision. It was a vision of wireless. We talked about connectivity anytime and anywhere. That was because we wanted folks to have the ability to connect with anyone and to do it from any place on the face of the earth. It was kind of a radical idea in 1990. In fact, some people thought it was kind of wacky. But here's a 1990s drawing, and this one actually appeared in IEEE Spectrum magazine. And as you can see, it illustrates the idea of anytime, anywhere connectivity. And you can also see that satellites were a pretty big part of the picture. But as Alaskans, you might notice that the guy that drew this thought that penguins live at the North Pole. I should have talked to him about that. Well, some folks thought it would never happen, but here's a story. It was just after sunset, a few days before Christmas 2017. The rocket was to be launched from Vandenberg Air Force Base, and that's a couple hundred miles north of Los Angeles. But when the people saw our rocket, those people in Los Angeles, they thought it was the Martians attacking. And there was one little guy that thought it was Santa Claus. But there was excitement in the air. In fact, there was a gray-haired Alaskan guy there that you might recognize. But the sky was dark, and the rocket and its condensation plume were illuminated by the sun. The sun had just set below the horizon, so the sky was dark, but the rocket and the condensation plume, which is pretty big, were illuminated by the setting sun. The people in Los Angeles saw something in the sky.
Got some breaking news to tell you about.
Strange lights over the sky in Southern California.
Guys, this is the end.
Oh my God.
That's crazy, man.
What is that?
I thought it was some aliens coming into town.
There's UFOs in Southern California.
Just spotted this in the sky. What in the world is this?
For a second we thought it was Santa Claus.
See that?
It looks beautiful, it looks amazing, it looks unreal.
Welcome all of you. Let's have a toast for a successful launch tomorrow night. It's looking great.
Welcome to Launch Complex 4. You are at the home of the mighty Falcon 9 that you see there. 227 feet above the Earth. 10 beautiful Iridium satellites ready to go into orbit.
As you all know, this is the second time this rocket's flown. That's pretty cool. We saw this baby go up in June, and it's going to take us up again.
Who wants to launch a rocket tomorrow? All right.
We're here December 22nd, just about an hour before flight, and the sun's setting. This is the fourth launch out of 8. We're going to be at the midway point. That's exciting. I'm nervous, like I always am, because this is the first time this industry is reusing rockets, and we're proud to be part of history here in some ways. But the most important thing is to get those 10 satellites on the top of that rocket into orbit, and that's really what's critical about today.
Good evening from Hawthorne, California. It is December 22nd, just after 5:12 p.m. Pacific Time. Welcome to the webcast of the Falcon 9 mission, carrying the fourth flight of 10 Iridium satellites.
Liftoff, Falcon
2 minutes into flight, getting it ready for ignition. We've had successful separation and ignition of the upper stage engine. First words from propulsion, things look good on the upper stage engine. And we have separation of the first Iridium satellite. You can see it at the bottom left of the screen drifting away. An on-time separation. Now every 100 seconds will begin a sequence where satellite 2, 3, 4, and continuing on will deploy. So we're 10 for 10. All 10 Iridium satellites have deployed right on time into the desired orbit.
To wrap things up for a great day, we're now 4 for 4. We've got 40 new Iridium Next satellites in the Constellation.
I think about 80 or 90 of our employees brought their kids and their spouses, and I tell you that for a lot of us, that's exciting to be able to celebrate this with other members of the Iridium team who have worked so hard with us to make all this happen. So launch 4 is complete now. It was probably the most spectacular launch of the year, and go Iridium, go team. We're on our way, and we're halfway, and I can see the end zone now, so exciting time to be here.
Well, that was pretty cool. That was the SpaceX rocket that they call the Falcon 9. They call it the Falcon 9 because it has 9 engines. Each engine develops 200,000 pounds of thrust for a total of 1.8 million pounds. And actually, SpaceX has even bigger rockets than that now, but that's the one we used. And that's the one that got our 10 satellites into orbit. That was actually launch number 4 in December of 2017. All the launches were completed in January of this year. There were a total of 8 launches. And so those 8 launches got 75 satellites up there. 66 are operational, and the other 9 are in-orbit spares. And those 66 satellites make a lot of interesting communication services possible. Well, let me tell you a little bit about satellite orbits. And specifically, to tell you the difference between a GEO orbit and a LEO orbit. Those are both acronyms. GEO stands for Geosynchronous Earth Orbit, and LEO for Low Earth Orbit. Now, a GEO orbit, that's the conventional one. That's the one where there are a lot of satellites up there right now, and lots of them are in use. That's an orbit that's 22,000 miles above the equator. All those satellites are above the equator, and they're actually 22,300 miles up. And that happens to be the altitude that makes the satellite go around the Earth once every 24 hours. So 24 hours is also the time it takes for the Earth to make one rotation. So if you can imagine the Earth rotating and the satellite going around at the same rate that the Earth is rotating, that means that from a location on the face of the Earth, the satellite stays at the same position in the sky, right? It's synchronous with the rotation of the Earth. That's why the satellite Earth stations that you see around don't move. They don't have to track. In the really early days of satellite communications, we had Earth stations that had to track. But with a geosynchronous orbit, that Earth station can just stay fixed all the time. A low Earth orbit is quite different. It's only a few hundred miles up. And at that altitude, it takes a satellite roughly 90 to 100 minutes to go around once. Now the orbit that I'm showing you here, in addition to being a low Earth orbit, it's also a polar orbit. In other words, it orbits from North Pole to South Pole. But actually, it's not necessarily the case for all LEO satellites, but the particular orbit that we use with Iridium is also a polar orbit. Well, there are a couple of things to know about the pros and cons of these two kinds of orbits. A geosynchronous Earth orbit, since it's 22,000 miles above the Earth, that means that by the time the signal travels from the satellite down to the surface of the Earth, it's pretty weak. It's just traveled 22,000 miles. And if you're taking EMAG or antennas, 1 over d squared, the signal's pretty weak. That's why you can't use a geo satellite using a small handheld device or a small antenna. You need a big parabolic reflector to gather that energy and boost the signal up to something that's usable. A LEO satellite, on the other hand, is much lower. The signal doesn't have to travel so far, and you can use a small antenna, something that you could put on a handheld device. Another difference between GEO and LEO is with the GEO satellites, since the signal has to travel 22,000 miles up and 22,000 miles down, you get delay. Radio signals travel at the speed of light, right? So crunch the numbers and you'll find out 22,000 miles up, 22,000 miles down, it takes a quarter of a second. And that's how we get the famous satellite delay. Has anybody ever talked on a telephone circuit that's going by satellite? If you have, you remember that satellite delay. But even if you haven't had that experience, if you're watching CNN or one of the other news channels, you may notice that from the time that the anchor asks the question of the correspondent in the Middle East or somewhere, asks the question, then how long does it take before the answer starts to come back? Have you noticed that? That's satellite delay. That's because they're talking on probably not just one hop, but probably on multiple hops to get from point A to point B, and so that's why it may take something like 2 seconds before that answer starts to come back. What about LEO? Well, LEO's only a few hundred miles up, so that signal moves very fast, up to the satellite and back down again. And the number turns out to be around 40 milliseconds, so that's, if you were talking on a phone connection with a 40 millisecond delay, you probably wouldn't even notice it. So we talked about the signal strength, the antennas that you need, and delay, which is also sometimes called latency. The other one to know is that a GEO satellite, if you can imagine its antenna beaming down on the surface of the Earth and staying in the same position, that defines the coverage area for that satellite. And it always stays the same because, as I said, the Earth and the rotations are matched up. But people talk about the footprint of a satellite, and they're talking about that coverage area. Well, a LEO satellite has a footprint too, but that one moves. So with LEO satellites, if you want to cover, say, the whole Earth, you're going to need a lot of LEO satellites because they're all moving around up there. So those are the big differences between those two. So here's a quick summary. GEO satellites, as I said, they're in high orbit. They have high latency, quarter second per hop. The coverage area is called a footprint. Oh, and they're also primarily used at low and mid latitudes. They're over the equator, right? So they're not going to do very well above the Arctic Circle. Why? Because over the equator, the curvature of the Earth. In fact, if you go up to Barrow and look at an Earth station up there, you'll see that it looks like it's aimed at the horizon. It looks, they call that the look angle. What's the elevation that you need on that antenna to be able to see the satellite? And so at high latitudes, you're going to get into those low look angles. And if you go far enough north, a GEO satellite just won't work at all. LEO, a few hundred miles up, low latency. It's going to take many satellites to provide full coverage. As I said, if they're in polar orbit, then we'll be able to cover all latitudes all the way up to the North Pole and down to the South Pole. So people really often ask me, what is Iridium's footprint? And the reason I ask that is because they're used to thinking about GEO satellites. It's just the normal question that people ask when you say satellite communication. What's the footprint? Am I in the footprint? Well, for Iridium, the answer is a little complicated. But you could say that Iridium's footprint is the whole world because we've got so many satellites up there. This is a map that shows an estimate of the terrestrial coverage of wireless networks around the world, and it covers approximately 15% of the Earth's surface. Here's Iridium's footprint, everywhere. We've got enough satellites up there that we cover everywhere on the face of the Earth. And here's a picture of one of our satellites. This is the latest generation, the generation that was just launched in the past couple of years. The most obvious feature there would be the big solar panels that collect solar energy, and that's how we power the satellite. And then underneath there you can see some antennas, which are the ones that beam down to the surface of the Earth. So we've got 6 orbits, and if you count them, you can count them all the way across here. And if you count them, you might think you're getting 7, but actually the one on the right is the same as the one on the left, right? Because they go from South Pole to North Pole and then back down again. If you were in space and if you look down on the North Pole from space, you could imagine 6 planes spaced at 30 degrees around a circle. And each one of those planes would define one of these orbits. Okay? So 6 orbits, and we have 11 satellites in each orbit for a total of 66 operational satellites. Those are the ones that are providing service. In addition to that, there are 9 in-orbit spares. Now, why would you want your spares to be in orbit? Well, if they're on the ground, and if you need it, you're going to have to launch a rocket. If they're already in orbit, then you fire some rockets on the spacecraft, move it into position, and it can take over for the failed satellite. Remind me at the end, I'll tell you a dramatic story about how we did lose one of the satellites on the earlier generation. So our low Earth orbit is 475 miles above the Earth, whizzing along at 17,000 miles per hour. And that means that it takes one satellite 8 minutes to move from horizon to horizon. So here's what I mean by that. If you could see that satellite from your position, and if you might see it rise above the southern horizon, right? And pass overhead, and then set below the northern horizon. But by the time that happens, there's already another satellite that's come up above the southern horizon, so that's how you get continuous coverage. Here's a pretty cool animation. This shows the 66 satellites in orbit. You can see the 6 orbits there, and the circles represent the coverage areas, or you might say the footprints of each one of the satellites. So you can see that every place on the surface of the Earth is covered, right? In some cases, there's significant overlap. There's a little overlap down in the lower latitudes, down near the horizon, but as those satellites converge near the pole, there's a lot of overlap up there. But the main point here is that it doesn't matter where you are on the Earth, you have coverage. And by the way, a couple other things about this. One is, it's not strictly true that that satellite is coming from due south to due north, as I just described. That was kind of a little bit of a simplification, because notice that the Earth is rotating underneath those orbits, right? So what does that mean if you're on the Earth? Would the satellite come up from due south? No, it would actually move from southeast to northwest. If you kind of visualize what that would look from the surface of the Earth. The other thing about these satellites is they're communicating not only with the ground, but they're communicating with each other. So we have what we call crosslinks. And this is not true. Most geosatellites are just what we call bent pipe, which means they just receive a signal and then just send it right back down to the ground again. But Iridium is different. Iridium has crosslinks. There's a lot of intelligence on those satellites. Each satellite is in communication with 4 other satellites. The one ahead and the one behind in the same orbit, and the one to the left and the one to the right. So communications, data communications, voice communications, they can all be relayed from one satellite to another. Well, what about the service? There are a lot of services that are provided, and Iridium divides their services into these 4 categories: land mobile, aviation, maritime, and Internet of Things. And I'm going to talk here mostly about land mobile, because that's the one that's easiest for most people to relate to. So within the land mobile category, we have dial-up. Dial-up is just what you think it is. It's just like your cell phone. There's an Iridium, we're going to eat after this is over with, I guess. Kimberly, are you wanting to have people take some pizza while I'm doing this, or wait till it's done?
It's up to you, sir.
It's
up to you.
Okay, we'll just wait a little bit. So this one works just like your cell phone. It's a little bit bigger than a cell phone. It's about this big. You pull the antenna up, and then you can dial a call to anywhere in the world as long as you have a clear view of the sky. And that's one thing that is a little different from cell phones is we're still dealing with some fairly weak signals here, and we're also at L-band, which is 1.6 gigahertz. And so it is important that you have a clear view of the sky. But if you have that, you can just dial your call just like you would on a cell phone. You can call anywhere in the world. To illustrate that, and also to illustrate these crosslinks that I was describing, I wanted to show you an example of a phone call that's coming from someone with an Iridium Extreme on a ship in the Atlantic off the coast of Africa. And it's going to a landline in New York City, just as an example. So how is that call routed? Well, it's uplinked to a nearby satellite over the Atlantic. Then it's relayed satellite to satellite until it gets to our US gateway station, which happens to be located in Arizona. And then from there, the call is routed over the terrestrial network to New York City. So here's what that looks like. This is the ship that is in the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of Africa. The call is placed. It goes up to an Iridium satellite. Then it's relayed to another satellite, and then to another satellite, and then to another satellite, until it's, and that satellite's over Arizona, so it goes down to our gateway in Arizona, and then over the terrestrial network until it's terminated in New York City. Yes, sir.
So you're not bouncing back and forth between terrestrial sites and satellites? It's just...
No, it goes up from the ship and it doesn't come down again until it comes down to Arizona. Which, in the case of a geo satellite would be doing what you just said, just up and down. Okay, another service is push to talk.
Yes, if I could interrupt on, because of 8 to 9 minutes, Horizon, I assume it would be switching satellites.
Oh, right.
Sometime during that conversation, presumably, if the conversation is extended.
Good point. Just like what happens with your cell phone, sometimes you need to be handed off, right? With your cell phone, you may be moving along in your car, and you may move beyond the range of one base station to another base station, and you have to be handed off. In this case, as Mr. Lehman pointed out, even if you're not moving, you still have to be handed off because the satellites are moving. So that's a good point. There's also our push-to-talk service, which also works through the Iridium Extreme. This is just like a walkie-talkie thing. There it is. You probably all use those somewhere along the line. It's another name for this kind of service in the terrestrial world is land mobile radio. So for example, in Alaska, we have the Alaska Land Mobile Radio System, which runs up and down the highway system and down in the southeast. There you can talk to anyone in your group as long as they're within range of the mountaintop repeater. That's how land mobile radio works. Iridium's push-to-talk is a little different than that. Since it's coming from these satellites in the sky and they're all interconnected, you could have a talk group comprised of people in any part of the world. So for example, you could define a talk group including Alaska, say Singapore, and South Africa. You could say, that's my talk group. And then the people in your group at those 3 locations would all be able to talk to each other. They'd all be able to hear each other, just as if they were on the same walkie-talkie or land mobile network. And then in addition to all that, whether you're using PTT or dial-up, each Iridium phone has an SOS button. And that's the one, it's right on the top, right here. You push the button and it puts you in immediate voice contact with a response coordination center. So if you're out in the wilds of Alaska and you have a problem, you probably really have a problem, and but you can get help that way. I should also talk about the Iridium Go. This is one that connects to your smartphone or your tablet. And so the Iridium Go is about this big. It's a little black box. You set it down. Again, it has to have a clear view of the sky. And it talks to your smartphone or your tablet by Wi-Fi and then to the Iridium satellite. And so you can use your smartphone for phone calls, text, email, and web browsing, just as you would normally use it, even though you're way beyond the range of the terrestrial networks. And then the last one I'll tell you about is the Iridium inReach, or it's made by Garmin, so I guess Garmin would call it the Garmin inReach. This is another one that uses the Iridium network, but rather than voice, this is good for texting. So again, you can text to anywhere, from anywhere, using the device, but since it's by Garmin, some of you probably have other Garmin devices, it's equipped with GPS, it does mapping, it helps you navigate, and so on. But in addition to that, you have two-way texting from anywhere to anywhere, and it also has an SOS button. Only in this case, the SOS puts you in text contact, not in voice contact. So that's the land mobile story, and I'm going to talk about some of the other services. We have a whole range, Iridium has a whole range of maritime products. I talked earlier about how geo satellites don't do too well in the northern latitudes or in the southern latitudes. And since we have a lot of shipping traffic now in the north, we've all been hearing about with climate change, we have ships going through the Northwest Passage, we even have cruise ships up there. It's even more so north of Russia. They have a huge amount of shipping traffic off their north coast. And it means that the geo satellites don't do too well. There's a geo satellite service that is traditionally used by maritime. It's called Inmarsat, stands for the International Maritime Satellite. That system doesn't work too well when you get pretty far north. So there's a lot of new interest in maritime. In fact, Iridium has now been certified by the international maritime agencies as now being fully capable and fully certified for maritime use. So if you're aboard a ship, there are different ways that this could be used. Most importantly, it can be used on the bridge by the skipper and the officers for critical traffic. But there are also some other equipments that can be used for, if it's a passenger ship, to provide convenient service for passengers, internet, phone service, etc. And also by the crew. Even cargo ships will make these services available for their crew as a kind of as a convenience for them or as a morale thing for the crew. If you're going to be at sea for months on end, you'd like to be able to talk to your family maybe. And so the same story, crew members, when the ship is appropriately equipped, can use their smartphones to call back home and send emails and things like that. There's also a range of products for aviation, and that means anything from small planes, like bush planes, all the way up to big jetliners. It's primarily used in the cockpit right now. This may change in the future, but I'd say right now, if you're flying on Alaska Airlines and you're using GoGo in-flight, you're probably not on Iridium. But you can be pretty sure that in the cockpit, they're using Iridium for reliable communication to the company and so on. I think it's fair to say that Malaysia airliner that went down somewhere in the Indian Ocean, if that had been equipped with Iridium, there'd be no mystery about where it went down. And then the last one is the Internet of Things. We all hear about the Internet of Things all the time. Small devices talking to each other over the internet. But in some cases, those small devices are beyond the range of conventional networks. So one example would be asset tracking. There's a whole industry of keeping track of cargo. It sounds a little bit odd, but railroads and trucking companies, they lose things. It's a big challenge for them to just keep track of everything that they're shipping. So in asset tracking, each item has a little device on it that connects to the Internet of Things. If those devices are somewhere beyond the range of conventional networks, then that's where Iridium comes in. Similarly, and this is a good one for Alaska, remote sensing. So we have seismic monitors all across the state monitoring earthquake activity, volcanic activity, tsunami activity. Those sensors can all be tied to each other using Iridium. Well, let me come back now to the inReach, and then we can have some pizza, I guess. The Iridium, or the Garmin inReach, which uses the Iridium network, as I said, it's got this SOS feature. And there have been some stories right here in Alaska where that SOS feature has come in really handy. In fact, there were some young climbers, about your age, I'd say, on, there's a mountain down near Prince William Sound called Mount Marcus Baker. Have you heard of it? Mount Marcus Baker. And so these young people had a problem.
What I love about Alaska is everything I want to do is here.
In Alaska, you can really get away from everything.
All of the experiences I have here are real and raw and wild. There isn't a trail going to every spot. It's all bucking through the brush or flying into the float plane.
People look at the maps of Alaska and they realize that the contour lines aren't at 40 feet, they're at 100 feet here. And that cliff band doesn't even show up on the map. And that valley is as big as San Francisco. You might start off and think you're going to be home that night and cell phone coverage goes down, and if you don't have anything with you or a plan or a way to communicate, it really is the small sprained ankles that can turn into the biggest epics. Alaska's so big, it's so wild and so remote. You really do always have to be prepared.
Hi, I'm Ben Still.
I'm Sean Cahoon.
I'm Danielle Varney.
Our objective was to climb Mount Marcus Baker. That's a 13,000 foot high peak that's on the ocean. And so there's 13,000 feet of relief that goes down into Prince William Sound, and the storms are notoriously horrible. It was supposed to be sunny for 2 days, and you can climb it in 1 day.
The reason we're standing here telling you the story is because of the inReach.
Our friend Connor was able to fly us in.
So he asked if we had any communication, kind of gave us a quick tutorial on how to do it. And we're like, all right, cool. So he's like, yeah, just shoot me a text when you're ready to get out of there. Off we went. And I woke up and I stuck my head out of the tent. We were just in the middle of a cloud, and I was like, this is not the way it's supposed to be.
It just kept getting worse and worse and worse.
And looked back at the tent, and there was like a tear forming. We were like, oh crap, we got to build snow cave here.
The snow just got deeper and deeper, and so we were 10 feet down. Our nice down sleeping bags are basically all wet and compressed down to just a thin nylon sheet.
And the three of us would just like bear hug each other.
And we were so deep down in the snowpack, airflow is a big problem. And so I turned the stove on, and then it just went out. And I was like, man, what's wrong with it? I realized there was no oxygen.
It was terrifying. When we hit the SOS button, that's when it started this whole rescue operation. We were sending and receiving everything from 15 feet under the surface of the snow, which was ridiculous.
So we were getting updates from Connor about all these sorties that were coming out with C-130s and Blackhawks and PJs and everything. And, you know, they flew like 36 hours trying to get us.
Just being able then to communicate with Connor and having these updates, like they're constantly flying, we're doing everything we can. You know, we're gonna get you guys out of there, just stay alive.
That was the week, seventh day.
And then the next thing we know, we could hear the chopper blades. Oh, holy cow. Tears, so many tears.
They swooped in and, you know, landed right next to our snow cave. And
if we didn't have the inReach, I don't think that would have ended well for us. You can't take anything for granted here.
Being prepared really for anything whenever you go out in the backcountry in Alaska is key.
If you're going to spend any time off the grid, off the road, out there, and you want to be sure to come back, then you need to have an inReach. It's the most important thing you can have.
Okay, so that is the inReach story, and that's the Iridium story. Thank you very much. I wanted to, I think we'll get to the pizza in just a minute here. I wanted to make a comment about those books that were mentioned in the introduction. There are two books. One is called Finding Alaska's Villages. That's the story about how a small group of engineers put together the first modern telecom services in rural Alaska. So before that time, the villages in western Alaska and northern Alaska had no modern telecom services at all. And the other one is Wi-Fi and the Bad Boys of Radio, which tells a story about another small group of engineers that built that first Wi-Fi network. And in case any of you are interested, both of those books are on Amazon. But the thing that ties those stories together, and even the story of Iridium, it's the story of engineers working together to do great things. It's true with the Wi-Fi story, it's true with the Alaska Village story, and it's true with the Iridium story. I think that's pretty cool, and that's why you might like those stories. You know, you hear a lot of high-ranking people making speeches sometimes about this stuff, but after all is said and done, it's the engineers. It's the engineers get in there, and they're the ones that get the job done. So that'll be you guys pretty soon, and we'll look forward to the great things that you're doing. I wanted to suggest that we take a break, get some pizza, and then we have a less formal back and forth. A couple things that we could talk about are, well, first of all, any questions you might have about the presentation. Also, there are some other LEO networks that have been in the news lately, like OneWeb and Starlink. I could tell you about those, and also Professor Mohammed is going to help me to talk a little bit about IEEE memberships.